You've got to be kidding me, the young engineer muttered, glaring at the enormous Pacific big boy steam locomotive sitting motionless on the tracks. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the rusted metal, but the beast of a machine wouldn't budge. The high-pitched whine of the engine, as if trying to scream, was drowned out by the engine's silent refusal to start. The crew, clad in their crisp overalls, exchanged frustrated glances. They'd tried everything: a battery jump, power cycling, recalibrating the systems. Nothing. The big boy wasn't having it. It's dead. We're stuck, one of them sighed, wiping sweat off his brow. The crew's youngest, Jacob, stood with his arms folded across his chest. This thing is ancient. Maybe it's time to let it go. The crew looked at each other, silently agreeing with the young man's conclusion. It was a hopeless situation, or so they thought. As the crew muttered among themselves, the old man leaned against a nearby post, watching the scene unfold. His gray hair was tucked under a faded cap, and his face was a map of time, with lines carved by decades of hard living. He had been there the whole time, barely noticed. No one seemed to recognize him, but he had seen it all before. "Maybe I can help," he said, his voice gravelly, barely loud enough to cut through the murmurs. The engineers paused and turned toward him. "And you are?" Jacob asked with a smirk, still confident in his youth and the latest tools at his disposal. "Franklin Callahan. Used to drive these things in the army," the old man replied, his eyes fixed on the train. "I know a thing or two about engines." The engineers snickered. "Yeah? Well, good luck with that, Pops. We've got the best tech money can buy here, and even it's not working," Jacob said dismissively. Franklin didn't flinch. He simply walked toward the massive locomotive, stepping over tools and cables the engineers had abandoned in frustration. The crew exchanged uncertain glances. "You've got 5 minutes," Jacob muttered, half expecting the old man to make a fool of himself. But Franklin didn't need 5 minutes. He just needed a few moments to examine the train, to feel the weight of its history and its machinery, to understand it the way he once had to on the battlefield. He crouched by the engine, his fingers tracing the contours of the metal. "This ain't a high-tech problem," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. "It's the fuel line. Someone missed the valve." The crew was skeptical, watching from a distance. They had already checked the fuel system, twice. But Franklin wasn't concerned with their doubts. With a few swift movements, he unclipped a panel, revealing a small valve tucked underneath the engine, practically hidden from view. He turned it with ease, and the train groaned to life. The sound of the engine roaring back to life filled the air, making the crew's jaws drop. "You did it," one engineer gasped, barely able to believe what he was seeing. Franklin stood up, brushing his hands off. "Just needed a little more attention," he muttered, wiping his brow. The big boy was alive again, and it had been Franklin Callahan, an old veteran, who had brought it back to life. The engineers stood in stunned silence. Jacob, once full of confident arrogance, could only stare in awe. You really know this stuff," he said, finally admitting what had become clear. Franklin smiled, a brief, knowing smile. "I used to be the best. Doesn't mean I stopped learning." The crew stood still, realizing they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Not just a train being fixed, but the revival of a legend who had never left, only waited for the right moment to remind them all of what true skill looked like. The sound of the train's massive wheels turning echoed in the cool evening air, the distant hum of the engine signaling its revival. Franklin stood still for a moment, watching the colossal machine churn back to life, the once still big boy, now roaring with newfound energy. The engineers, who had written it off as a lost cause, exchanged uncertain looks. Their hands still trembled with disbelief. "How the hell did you?" Jacob started, his voice trailing off, unable to put words to what he had just witnessed. Franklin didn't look back at him. His eyes were fixed on the train, his hand resting on the cold metal of the locomotive as though he could feel its pulse. "It's not magic," Franklin said quietly, his voice low but carrying the weight of experience. "It's just knowing how to listen to the old machines." The crew stood in stunned silence as the last of the steam hissed out of the vents, the sound like a deep sigh of relief. Jacob, the young engineer who had dismissed Franklin earlier, finally spoke up. "You've been doing this for years, haven't you?" Franklin's gaze softened slightly. "Been at it longer than you've been alive." The weight of his words wasn't lost on anyone. For a brief moment, Jacob saw the quiet years of experience behind Franklin's weathered face. It wasn't just about fixing trains or machines. It was about knowing what they were trying to say. The other engineers, once skeptical, now gathered around Franklin, their disbelief slowly turning into respect. Franklin's steady hands, worn from decades of hard work, ran over the parts of the engine with the familiarity of someone who had been in countless battles, not with weapons, but with machines. He could hear what they couldn't. He could feel the tension in the gears, the exact pressure of the fuel lines. And it was all second nature to him. "You've seen the war, haven't you?" one of the younger engineers asked, a note of awe creeping into his voice. Franklin's eyes flickered with the memory. The question wasn't really about the train anymore. It was about something deeper. He gave a brief nod, not needing to explain further. "A lot of people think the war's over," Franklin continued, his tone more reflective now. "But the machines keep going. They don't stop. They don't forget." The others exchanged uneasy glances. "What do you mean by that?" Jacob asked, but Franklin didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back from the train and wiped his hands on his faded jacket. The steam from the engine billowed around them, the atmosphere heavy with the smell of oil and history. He looked over his shoulder, seeing the young crew still processing everything that had just happened. You've got to know when to listen. Sometimes, it's not about the newest gadget or the fastest fix. It's about understanding what's been there all along. As the last of the steam faded and the train stood ready, Franklin gave a small nod. "That's how it's done." The engineers stood, the weight of his words sinking in, realizing just how much they had to learn from the old man standing before them. Franklin wasn't just a driver. He was a bridge to a past they would never fully understand. As the big boy train chugged down the track, powered by Franklin's touch, the young engineers knew one thing for certain. They had just witnessed something extraordinary, and it had nothing to do with tools or technology. It had everything to do with respect, experience, and the understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing in the room isn't the machine, but the hands that know how to control it. The train moved steadily now, the rhythmic clanking of the tracks beneath it like a pulse. Franklin sat at the controls, his hands expertly guiding the old machine. The engineers, still in awe of what had just happened, stood at the edge of the platform, watching the big boy glide down the tracks. It was an impossible sight, a machine that had been deemed broken and obsolete now running like it had just been built. Jacob couldn't help but stare, his mind still reeling. "How did you know that valve was the problem?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Franklin's eyes remained focused on the train ahead. "You learn to read the signs. It's all about experience." His voice was calm, steady, but there was a weight to it that made Jacob pause. The young engineer had always believed that fixing things was a matter of logic, science, and technology. But here was Franklin, an old man who had never seen the inside of a lab, and yet he had fixed what the newest technology couldn't. Jacob couldn't help but feel a shift inside him. He had underestimated Franklin, like everyone else. And now he was forced to reckon with the fact that experience held more power than all the modern gadgets he had ever used. As the train rumbled on, the crew members slowly began to gather around Franklin. There was something unspoken in the air, a change in the way they looked at him. They had seen him as just an old man, a relic of a bygone era, but now they understood that Franklin was no ordinary person. He was a living testament to everything they thought they knew about machines. "You've been doing this for a long time, haven't you?" one of the engineers asked, stepping forward. Franklin's hand tightened slightly on the controls, but he didn't look up. "Longer than most of you have been alive," he replied, his tone not boastful, but matter of fact. The engineers exchanged glances, realizing that they were standing in the presence of someone who had lived through the kind of experiences they could only read about in books. "So what's next?" Jacob asked, breaking the silence. "How do we keep this thing running?" Franklin's eyes flickered to him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You learn. You keep listening. And you don't forget what's important." There was a finality in his words, as if that was all there was to it. The young engineers nodded, not quite understanding everything Franklin had said, but feeling the weight of it. They would have to learn to listen, just like Franklin did. As the train continued down the tracks, they could feel the subtle shift in the air around them. The once doubtful engineers now had a newfound respect for Franklin. They knew that no machine, no matter how complex, could outlast the knowledge of a true veteran. Franklin's hands remained steady on the controls, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. He had done his part. The train was running again, and the engineers, well, they would have to find their own way. But one thing was clear: they would never look at machines or veterans the same way again. The train continued down the track, the sound of its wheels clicking steadily against the rails. Franklin sat in the engineer's seat, his hands firm on the controls as the train cut through the quiet landscape. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, a peaceful contrast to the machine's steady hum. Franklin had been driving trains for as long as he could remember. It was more than just a job. It was a part of him, like the air he breathed. The engineers, now gathered at the rear of the train, exchanged quiet words, their respect for Franklin growing with every passing mile. They had seen him do what they thought was impossible, and now they realized they were witnessing a skill that had been honed over decades of experience. "How does he do it?" Jacob asked quietly, his eyes following Franklin's movements. The others, once skeptical, now watched in awe. "It's not about the technology," one of the engineers said, shaking his head. "It's about the man. He's seen things, done things that we can't even begin to imagine." They were right. Franklin didn't rely on the newest gadgets or the latest technology. His expertise came from years of hands-on experience, from years of knowing the ins and outs of every machine he had ever worked on. He knew how to listen to them, how to feel their rhythms, how to understand when something was wrong long before a system diagnostic could even begin to analyze it. As the train picked up speed, Franklin's mind wandered back to his younger days. He remembered the countless nights spent in the cockpit of military vehicles, his fingers gripping the controls as if his life depended on it. In many ways, it did. Back then, he had learned that machines weren't just metal and bolts. They were alive, with their own language. And over the years, he had become fluent in that language. The engineers around him didn't understand that. They were still trying to figure out the modern, high-tech systems that were meant to make their work easier. But Franklin knew the truth. Technology was only as good as the person behind it. And when that person knew the machine would never fail them. Franklin's gaze flickered over to the engineers. They were still talking amongst themselves, but now there was a sense of respect in their voices. They had seen him work, and now they knew that what he had was something far more valuable than the latest technology. It was experience. It was wisdom. It was a connection to the past that couldn't be replicated with code or sensors. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned dark, the train continued its journey, steady and strong. Franklin didn't look back at the engineers. He didn't need to. He knew they understood now. He had taught them something they would never forget. It wasn't about the machines. It was about the people who knew how to make them sing. The train rolled steadily along the tracks as the night deepened. The cool air from the open windows brought in the scent of fresh earth and pine, mingling with the hum of the powerful machine beneath them. Franklin's hands remained steady on the controls, his mind wandering back to the years that had passed, to the countless moments spent fixing engines and machines, saving lives, and finding solutions where others saw only problems. He had always been drawn to the sound of machines, their rhythms, their quiet whispers when something was wrong. And now, as the train glided through the countryside, he couldn't help but wonder how many people had forgotten that. Around him, the younger engineers were still watching him closely, their eyes filled with questions, curiosity, and awe. They had seen what he could do, how effortlessly he had made the big boy come to life when it seemed destined to stay silent. But what they didn't realize was that Franklin wasn't just fixing an old train. He was reconnecting with a piece of his own past. He had been a mechanic, a driver, and a soldier all rolled into one, and that had shaped the man he had become. It wasn't just about the machines. It was about the moments they had lived through together. "You've seen a lot, haven't you?" One of the engineers, Chris, asked, his voice breaking through the silence. Franklin looked over at him. "Seen enough to know that machines don't lie," he replied quietly. The engineers exchanged a glance, unsure how to respond. "But it's more than just the machines, isn't it?" Chris pressed. Franklin's eyes softened as he looked out the window. "It's about knowing them, listening to them. You won't find that in any manual or computer system. It's something you have to feel." The others were quiet, letting his words sink in. Franklin wasn't just talking about fixing trains or engines. He was talking about the kind of wisdom that could only come from experience. It wasn't something that could be taught in a classroom or learned from textbooks. It was something you earned, something that came with time and trials. I've been driving machines like this since before most of you were born, Franklin continued, his voice calm but filled with the weight of years. But it wasn't just the machines that taught me, it was the people, the ones who relied on me. And I never forgot that. As the train clicked along the rails, Franklin's words hung in the air, their meaning slowly dawning on the engineers. They had spent their careers focused on the latest technology, the newest equipment, but Franklin's knowledge came from a different place. It came from the heart of a veteran who had lived through more than anyone could imagine. I think I'm starting to understand, Jacob said quietly, his voice filled with a mix of admiration and newfound respect. Franklin didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them, the only sound being the steady hum of the train. He didn't need to explain himself further. The engineers were beginning to get it. They were beginning to understand what it truly meant to be a master of your craft, not just because of the tools you used, but because of the experiences that shaped you. And for the first time, they weren't just seeing Franklin as an old man. They were seeing him as the legend he was. As the train continued on its journey, Franklin allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't about proving anything anymore. The engineers had learned. They had seen the value of experience, of listening, of understanding the machines and the people around them. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in a while, Franklin felt like the journey had meaning again. The train rumbled on, its steady rhythm now a familiar companion to the engineers who stood watching from the rear. Franklin's hands remained firm on the controls, his eyes scanning the landscape ahead. The night had settled in fully, and the cool air flowed through the windows, mixing with the low hum of the train. Jacob, now standing by Franklin's side, couldn't help but watch the man, whose quiet demeanor and experience seemed to have taught him more than any classroom could. He had never seen anyone work with such precision and calm before. Franklin had turned something that had seemed impossible into a moment of triumph. It wasn't about the technology or the fancy tools. It was about understanding, about feeling the machine as part of something bigger. How do you keep going like this? Jacob finally asked, his voice breaking the silence. Franklin looked at him, his eyes steady and calm. It's not about keeping going, he said quietly. It's about knowing when to stop and listen. When you've been around as long as I have, you start to understand that machines, like people, need care. They need respect. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Jacob wasn't sure if he was talking about the train or something deeper. Franklin had lived a life where listening, truly listening, had saved him time and again. Machines, much like people, could only take so much before they broke. And the key wasn't in fixing them with tools. It was in understanding them enough to know what was wrong long before anyone else. Jacob's thoughts turned back to the engineers, who had been so quick to dismiss Franklin in the beginning. They had thought they knew everything there was to know about fixing trains. They had relied on the latest technology, the sharpest minds, the most expensive equipment. But none of it mattered when it came to the real work. It was Franklin's quiet wisdom that had made the difference, the ability to recognize what the machine needed and to fix it with precision. The world, as Jacob was starting to understand, wasn't as black and white as he had once thought. There was more than one way to approach a problem, and sometimes, experience mattered more than the latest tech. As the train picked up speed, Franklin remained as composed as ever. His gaze never wavered, his hands guiding the train with steady confidence. Jacob glanced at the others, who had slowly gathered around. They were starting to understand. The skepticism had been replaced with admiration, and slowly, a new respect had begun to grow. They had learned something valuable that day, not just about fixing machines, but about the value of experience. Franklin wasn't just a mechanic or a driver. He was a living piece of history, a reminder that sometimes the best solutions come not from machines or gadgets, but from the hands of those who've lived long enough to understand what the world is really saying. As the train continued its journey, Franklin didn't speak again, allowing the silence to settle in. He didn't need to. The engineers had learned what they needed to know. The world of machines was vast, but now, they saw it through a different lens. The road ahead was long, and the train would keep moving forward, but the lessons learned that night would stay with them for a long time. The train continued its steady pace through the night, the landscape now nothing more than shadowed outlines in the moonlight. Franklin sat still, the hum of the engine filling the air. Jacob, standing quietly beside him, couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. He had always thought he knew what it meant to be skilled, to understand a craft. But Franklin had shown him a new kind of mastery, one that went beyond tools, beyond technology. It was a mastery born from a lifetime of experience, a life full of lessons learned the hard way. "You know," Jacob said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself, "I thought I had a handle on things. But I was wrong. It's not about the latest equipment or the newest systems. It's about what you've learned along the way and how you use it." Franklin didn't look at him, but he knew that Jacob's words held truth. There was something humbling about seeing someone so young realize the value of experience. It was a rare thing, and Franklin couldn't help but feel a quiet pride in it. The engineers, still gathered at the back of the train, were beginning to move closer. Their conversations had quieted, the sound of their voices now more reflective, as if they, too, were processing everything that had happened. Franklin had become more than just a teacher that day. He had become a living embodiment of the wisdom they all needed to understand. One of the engineers, Chris, finally spoke up again. "I think we've been going about this all wrong," he said, his voice a little more thoughtful than before. "We've been so focused on fixing things the right way, by the book. But Franklin here, he's shown us that sometimes the answer is just knowing the machine better than anyone else." The others nodded in agreement. Jacob found himself reflecting on his own approach to the world. He had always been quick to rely on data, on the clean precision of technology. But what Franklin had shown him wasn't just about machines. It was about people, about relationships, about understanding that the best tools were often the ones you couldn't see or measure. As the train moved along, the landscape changing once again, Jacob's mind raced with new thoughts. He was beginning to see his place in the world a little differently. The engineers, too, were learning. They had come to realize that the greatest asset they had was the ability to learn, to listen, and to apply what they knew in new and unexpected ways. The air grew cooler as the train sped through the countryside. Franklin didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. His actions had already spoken louder than any words ever could. The engineers had learned what they needed to learn. They understood, now, that there was more to their work than just solving problems with tools. Sometimes, the best solution came from simply understanding the world around you and using the knowledge you already had. Franklin's gaze remained steady, his hands sure on the controls. There was no hesitation in his movements. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. He had already shown them that the value of experience couldn't be measured in charts or graphs. It was something deeper, something that took years to build, and even longer to truly appreciate. The train continued on its journey, the steady thrum of the engine now a quiet companion to the engineers who stood at the back, their thoughts quiet but full. They weren't just riding the train anymore. They were beginning to understand it, and maybe, just maybe, they were starting to understand themselves a little better too. As the train continued its journey through the night, the mood among the engineers shifted. What had started as a quiet admiration for Franklin's ability had now turned into something deeper. They weren't just impressed by his knowledge of machines. They were beginning to understand the way he saw the world. The big boy was running smoothly now, the steady rumble of the tracks underfoot almost comforting. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Jacob couldn't focus on the train itself. His thoughts were somewhere else, drifting back to the lessons Franklin had quietly taught him. It wasn't just about how to fix things, it was about how to see things, how to approach the world with patience and understanding. Jacob had spent most of his life relying on facts and numbers. It was always about getting the right readings, finding the right equation, solving the problem by the book. But Franklin had shown him a different way. It was about listening, about feeling the pulse of the machine, and more than that, it was about knowing when to wait and when to act. It was a lesson in not rushing, in giving things time to reveal themselves. The train's powerful engine seemed almost symbolic to Jacob now. It wasn't just about moving forward. It was about moving forward with purpose, with respect for the journey. He had spent his career thinking that the goal was always to get to the next station as quickly as possible, but Franklin had reminded him. that sometimes the value wasn't in the destination, it was in how you got there. The engineers, who had once been dismissive of Franklin, were now silently watching him, understanding what they had missed before. Franklin wasn't just some old man who had worked on trains. He was a living testament to the value of experience, of quiet strength. His presence was steady, unshaken, and it made them all realize that there was something they could learn from him, something they had never considered before. As the train cut through the landscape, the hum of the wheels against the tracks became a sort of heartbeat, steady and consistent. Franklin, still focused on the task at hand, seemed perfectly at peace. He wasn't rushing, wasn't worried about the time or the distance. He was simply doing what he knew best, guiding the train with a steady hand. Jacob couldn't help but wonder how many times Franklin had done this in his life. How many times had he driven this same machine, seen this same landscape, but still approached it with the same calm, the same unwavering focus. It was a thought that struck Jacob deeply. In all his years of working with the latest technologies, he had never stopped to think about the deeper connection one could have with their work. He realized now that Franklin wasn't just a mechanic or an engineer. He was a master of his craft, a man who understood that the true essence of working with something, anything, wasn't in controlling it. It was in understanding it. Jacob looked out the window, watching the stars flicker by, and for the first time, he felt like he was truly part of the journey. He wasn't just along for the ride anymore. He was beginning to understand the beauty of it, the rhythm of it. And it wasn't about what was next. It was about appreciating where they were, right now, in this moment. The quiet lessons Franklin had imparted weren't just about trains. They were about life, about the way you approached everything you did. As the train continued forward, Franklin remained at the helm, guiding them with the wisdom of someone who had learned long ago that the best way to navigate the world was not with speed or haste, but with patience and understanding. As the train approached the next station, the sound of its powerful wheels slowing down filled the air, a smooth contrast to the relentless speed they had maintained for so long. Franklin kept his hands steady on the controls, his eyes calm as he guided the massive machine into its final approach. The engineers, now standing behind him, watched with newfound respect. They had learned much over the past hours, not just about fixing machines, but about how to approach work, how to see the world, and how to truly understand the value of experience. Jacob stood closest to Franklin, his gaze fixed on the train's path as it began to slow, the rhythm of the wheels on the track creating a peaceful, almost hypnotic sound. "It's different, isn't it?" Jacob said, his voice soft but filled with wonder. Franklin glanced at him briefly, his expression unreadable. "Different how?" Franklin asked, his voice low but firm. Jacob thought for a moment, then spoke, his words coming slower than usual, as if he was still processing everything he had learned. "I mean, it's like, everything makes sense now. It's not just about fixing things. It's about understanding them. You taught me that." Franklin didn't respond immediately, his hands moving instinctively to adjust a dial on the controls. The quiet moments between them were often the most telling. Franklin didn't need to speak to communicate. His presence alone had already conveyed everything they needed to learn. "You've got the right idea," Franklin said after a long pause. "Machines aren't just things to fix. They're part of the system. They work when you understand their rhythm. You learn their weaknesses, their strengths, and when to listen." Jacob nodded slowly. He had never thought of it that way before. Machines had always been just that, machines. But Franklin had made him realize that there was something deeper to it, something almost human in the way they worked, in the way they responded to care, attention, and time. "And you're right," Franklin continued, his voice a little softer now. "It's not just about fixing things. It's about knowing when to stop and think, when to listen. The rest will follow." Jacob's mind raced as he processed Franklin's words. It was simple advice, but profound in its simplicity. He realized now that he had been so caught up in the rush of things, in the need to fix and move on to the next task, that he had missed the most important part of the work, understanding the work itself. The train continued to slow, now nearing the station. The lights from the platform flickered ahead, casting long shadows on the tracks. Franklin turned his gaze to the engineers behind him. "You all got a lot to learn," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "And that's good. The more you learn, the more you can give back." But never forget that the work is just as much about understanding the machine as it is about understanding yourself. As the train came to a full stop, the engineers stood still, the weight of Franklin's words settling over them like the calm after a storm. They hadn't just witnessed a man fix a machine. They had witnessed a master at work, a master who understood that true skill was about more than just doing. It was about knowing why you did it and what it meant. Franklin stood up from the controls, his body stiff with age but still strong. He didn't look back at the engineers. They didn't need to hear more from him. They had learned everything they needed to. The train had stopped, but for the engineers, the journey had only just begun. And as they filed off the train, Jacob couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. Not just for Franklin, but for the lessons he had imparted. He wasn't just a mechanic, he was a teacher, a guide. And for the first time, Jacob understood just how much that kind of wisdom was worth.